Hello class, welcome to the third installment of Nietzsche on Art and Aesthetics. So far we've covered the earliest Nietzsche on these topics, the birth of tragedy, as well as via Heidegger the very latest Nietzsche, the Will to Power's art notebooks. But that's a lot like a sandwich with nothing in the middle. So in this video we're going to examine the most interesting stuff that came between. As with everything Nietzsche, it's going to be a bit of a wild ride, so strap in and welcome to the middle to later Nietzsche on art and aesthetics, delimiting art, and art in the optics of life. Let's begin with a few situating remarks from the Daniel Kame introduction to the edited volume Nietzsche on Art and Life. Kame begins by noting that Nietzsche was not interested in art as such, nor was he interested in constructing an aesthetic theory of a recognizable traditional sort, a la Hume or Kant. That is to say, he was not interested in the internal constitution of aesthetic judgments or the degree of objectivity attributable to them. Rather, Nietzsche was concerned with art from the perspective of life. For he regarded the significance of art to lie not in art for art's sake, but in the answers it provides to the problems of how to value the human experience. Next, Kame notes that while some of Nietzsche's mature reflections on art and aesthetics could be read in terms of aesthetic anti-realism, i.e. beauty is a mind-dependent aesthetic property, limiting the discussion of Nietzsche's aesthetics to such topics of philosophical aesthetics risks shortchanging their philosophical value. For when we look more closely, most of Nietzsche's remarks on art and aesthetics have a practical and existential dimension and import. They are less about the nature of art as such and more about the relationship between art and life, especially how to engage art within a project of the affirmation of life, cultural renewal, and exemplary human living. Indeed, all the big Nietzschean themes, and you can study this more in my existentialism course, are practical existential, focused on the nature and value of subjective individual existence in the contexts of the death of God, nihilism, suffering, eternal recurrence, self-creation, and affirmation. Nietzsche is quite prominent in Anglo-American scholarship. However, attempts to make Nietzsche speak to the concerns of contemporary metaphysicians, epistemologists, and ethicists often leads to neglect or distortion of Nietzsche's deeper interests. And on this note, there is also a tendency in much of the recent English language scholarship on Nietzsche to try to interpret his writings in isolation from his views on art. Most of the texts we'll be covering in this session are seldom written on carefully by scholars. Kame notes there may be sociological reasons for this, insofar as aesthetics in recent Anglo-American philosophy has been generally regarded as the poorer, less sophisticated cousin of ethics. Indeed, some have had grave doubts as to whether philosophical aesthetics is a bona fide subject at all. Of course, some kind of link between ethics and aesthetics is implied by the common value judgment classification, i.e. what Plato would have called axiology, which included both aesthetic and ethical value, and what we moderns tend to take as the theory of values. From the point of view of the higher value placed on ethics in most contemporary philosophical discourse, art very often seems like holiday life and not a proper metaphysical, epistemological, or ethical activity. If this is right, Kame remarks, it would appear that there is some truth in the received wisdom regarding the relative standing of ethics and aesthetics. But what this piece of philosophical orthodoxy assumes, and this is something that Nietzsche would seek to reject, is that the nature of ethical and aesthetic judgment is fixed and immutable. In fact, the relation of aesthetics and ethics varies and transforms itself widely based on cultural context. What is the core of Nietzsche's philosophy of art or his philosophical aesthetics? Controversially, we can locate it in a remark in his first published work, The Birth of Tragedy, when he writes that art is the highest task, the real metaphysical activity of this life. This high status assigned to art will be rigorously questioned in Human All Too Human, as we'll read this week, but it will return in later writings in a modified form. For example, when he writes in the 1886 Attempt at Self-Criticism that art, and not morality, is the real metaphysical activity of man. This basic position and line of argumentation is indeed the very one that Heidegger emphasizes and responds to in the late notebooks, The Will to Power as Art. And it's not an incorrect interpretation of Nietzsche, rather an insightful one based on close and careful evaluation of Nietzsche's remarks on the essence of art, and struggles with his own remarks across his many published and unpublished works. Sometimes referring to Nietzsche's remarks on art and aesthetics in the early and middle period to make his case, Heidegger probably also has good reasons to leave out of account much of Nietzsche's thought on these topics in the middle period. However, Nietzsche arrived at his final positions on art and aesthetics and their role and value in relationship to morality, religion, science, and life only very gradually from the years 1873 to 1887. Many possibly incompatible positions were evaluated along the way, beginning with Human All Too Human, the goal of which was to do away with metaphysical illusions of art and religion, to abolish all false idealisms, to vindicate science, and to create free spirits. Nietzsche sums up the motto for the work in Ecce Homo: where you see ideal things, I see what is human, alas, all too human, I know man better. Applying this judgment to the realm of art and aesthetics would seem to involve a significant devaluation of art as a saving power or the only satisfactory theodicy, as we hear in The Birth of Tragedy, as well as a careful rethinking of the metaphysical status of art. This all gives us very good reason to return to Nietzsche's middle period views on art and aesthetics at this point in the course. Beginning especially in 1872-3 with Human All Too Human, and subsequent works of the so-called Free Spirit trilogy, The Dawn and the Gay Science, Nietzsche stages various dimensions of conflict between the domains of art, morality, and science, while at the same time engaging in nuanced, close, and wonderful readings of much of the Western canon. Perhaps most importantly, it is in Human All Too Human that Nietzsche invents the bicameral mind hypothesis, speaking of a double brain or two brain chambers, one to experience science and the other non-science. It's also here that he begins to speak in the language of physiology, excoriated by Heidegger. Future philosophy will at last bring us a chemistry of sensations and concepts. Past Heidegger's justifiable worry about the language of physiology in Nietzsche, this has proven to be exactly what occurred in modern pharmacology and neurobiology. It is also in this work that Nietzsche introduces the themes of incorporating knowledge, that is, actually learning to digest our various epistemes, or ways of knowing, so no longer taking religious revelation or logic for granted. The process of incorporating knowledge is tantamount to our becoming, in Nietzsche's reading, a properly existential species, that is, coming to know ourselves without the illusions of traditional metaphysics. And within this project, of course, traditional Judeo-Christian morality doesn't fare so well, and nor does art. Sometimes in Nietzsche's later period writings, art is in the decline, deceiving us, better that we do without it if we can, preferring the water of science to the wine of art. But before long, art is again often on the ascendancy. It's what makes life possible to live so that we can affirm life, etc. Human All Too Human is most simply glossed as the book in which he finalized his disavowal of Wagnerian opera as a futural collective artwork, repudiated all false idealisms, and rejected the artist metaphysics of his own Birth of Tragedy. It is the period of Nietzsche's heroically modernist sobering up, we could say, from his earlier romantic pessimism. And in some ways, Nietzsche's companion, as well as target at times, is Goethe's Faust. The second volume in Nietzsche's Free Spirit trilogy, The Dawn, is more exclusively focused on the origin and history of morality. By the Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra, can note a certain return to art, to inspiration, and to the Dionysian. Although Nietzsche's concept of the Dionysian is not extensively rehabilitated and reavowed during this middle period, except in a couple of places here and there. So let's turn to Human All Too Human. First looking at Nietzsche's references to art and aesthetics earlier in the work, and then focusing of Book 4 of the work on the souls of artists and writers. The spirit of the work is best characterized by Nietzsche himself in the opening of a new preface to it he penned in 1885. Quote, "My writings have been called a schooling in suspicion, even more in contempt, but fortunately also in courage, indeed in audacity. I have sought shelter in this or that, in some piece of admiration or enmity or scientificality or frivolity or stupidity. Where I could not find what I needed, I had artificially to enforce, falsify, invent a suitable fiction for myself. And what else have poets ever done? And to what end does art exist in the world at all?" These remarks double back on and already critique the content of the work itself from the point of view of Nietzsche's later thought. His heroically modernist sobering up and avowal of science versus art reflected the spiritual need of this point in Nietzsche's life, but was itself a kind of suitable fiction. Nietzsche goes on, "Perhaps in this regard, I might be reproached with having employed a certain amount of art, in scare quotes, a certain amount of false coinage, likewise that I deceived myself over Richard Wagner's incurable romanticism, as though it were a beginning and not an end." likewise over the Greeks, and likewise over the Germans and their future. And perhaps a whole long list could be made of such likewises. The theme sounded here is, of course, life's need for deception, and thus for art. As Nietzsche puts it, enough, I am still living, and life is, after all, not a product of morality. It wants deception. It lives on deception. Probably the best example of this deception in Human All Too Human itself is Aphorism 222, Nietzsche's new messianic proclamation that the scientific man is the further evolution of the artistic. Human All Too Human is through and through a book of scientific optimism, of progress, of modern culture, sometimes called Nietzsche's most democratic book, of the end of tragedy and suffering, and the beginning of a new age of comparison and rigorous thinking. The epigraph to the work came from the French Enlightenment thinker Voltaire. It is possible to speak of this as the book of Nietzsche's enlightenment, but it's significant that from the very start of the work in the new preface, this aspect is called into question as itself still mired in elements of deception. So let's look to some of Nietzsche's remarks on art and aesthetics in the books leading up to Of the Souls in Artists and Writers. In the section of First and Last Things, Origins and Ends, or Arches and Eschatons, all we now require, and what can be given us only now that the individual sciences have attained their present level, is a chemistry of the moral, religious, aesthetic conceptions and sensations. Likewise of all the agitations we experience within ourselves in cultural and social intercourse, and indeed even when we are alone. What if this chemistry would end up revealing that in this domain too, the most glorious colors are derived from base, indeed from despised materials? Will there be many who desire to pursue such researches? The answer to this, at least since the mid-20th century in experimental psychology, is a resounding yes. Of course, being able to provide a chemistry or neurobiology and psychophysiology of moral, religious, and aesthetic dimensions of human existence is not the same thing as fully explaining and reducing them to this chemistry. Nevertheless, such a project promises to be an illuminating one. Notice here for Nietzsche how it sets science over and above, to some extent, morality, religion, and art. In a way, philosophy's final metamorphosis into science is for this Nietzsche a promising development, where it will lead to greater analytical clarity in our self-understanding, as well as a higher estimation of what he calls unpretentious truths. In Aphorism 3, it is the mark of a higher culture to value the little unpretentious truths which have been discovered by means of rigorous method, more highly than the errors handed down by the metaphysical and artistic ages and men, which blind us and make us happy. Art and metaphysical philosophy go hand in hand here for Nietzsche in producing blindness and happy illusions. In the history of both philosophy and art, we find the worshippers of form with their standards of the beautiful and the sublime, who no doubt will at first react to these new methodical, unpretentious truths with mockery and scorn. This reactionism, when the scientific spirit begins to predominate, is for Nietzsche a symptom of our metaphysical innocence. Artists and philosophers will react to the claims of science with dismissal only because either their eye has not yet discovered the charm of the simplest form, or because those raised in the scientific spirit are as yet very far from being thoroughly permeated by it. Like the bad scientists, the artists and philosophers still thoughtlessly imitate old forms, and do so badly, as does everyone to whom a thing no longer matters very much. Formerly, the human spirit and human culture was not engaged so much in rigorous thinking. Its more serious occupation was the spinning out of forms and symbols, that is, metaphysical yarns with which to contain, enhance, or comfort life. Nietzsche next notes that the relation between sense and form, the sensible world and the intellectual, has changed remarkably in the transition from ancient to modern experience. As our arts themselves grow ever more intellectual, so the forms of our life will grow ever more spiritual. The realm of inner spiritual beauty is continually growing deeper and wider, far from denigrating the decentralization, aka spiritualization, of philosophy, art, and religion. Nietzsche sees in this a positive process that now gives the eye of insight, that is science, something to do, namely to reevaluate all our values, without the admixture of metaphysical illusions and projections. This process does not take away the development of our spirituality for Nietzsche, but rather reflects a refinement and interiorization of that spirituality, a larger, clearer, and freer domain, even if an uglier one, in which the spiritual beauty of human forms can continually grow deeper and wider. Previous metaphysics for Nietzsche has tended to oversimplify the world in accordance with our aesthetic anthropomorphisms and prejudices. That is, our preferences for harmony, simplicity, balance, totality, integrity, consonance, etc., all the traditional metaphysical properties of beauty. This type of metaphysics is not innocuous for Nietzsche because it falsifies both the cosmos and the human reality. Future metaphysics, informed by the chemistry of sensations and concepts by the new science, will, however, be more innocuous. As Nietzsche writes in Ephraism 10, as soon as the origin of religion, art, and morality is so described that it can be perfectly understood without the postulation of metaphysical interference, at the commencement or in the course of their progress, that is, without the God above nature, or the jus ex machina or appearance of the divine in the course of history, at this point the greater part of our interest in the purely theoretical problem of the thing in itself and appearance ceases to exist. This is an early statement of the phenomenalism and perspectivism that Nietzsche's later thought will come increasingly to rally around. Conscient thing in itself, or noumenal reality, which sets limits to speculative metaphysics, morality, and art, is still a shadow of God or totality, an illusion of the true world that blocks our path to an adequate accounting with phenomena and the play of perspectival appearances. Nietzsche goes on, for within religion, art, and morality, we do not touch upon the nature of the world in itself. So art is not the presentation of the absolute. Just as we are ineluctably in the realm of phenomena, so we are in the realm of ideas, and no originary, divine, or speculative intuition can take us any further. Note that human all too human here still affirms the existence of a metaphysical world, just not the metaphysical world revealed in religion, art, or previous philosophy. This is a world which has no need of the postulate of God as the center, or of the thing itself as the unifying ground of our speculative categories. For Nietzsche, through science, we are getting closer to the true nature of the world. And in contrast, religion, morality, and art all create specters, haunting ghosts of the most valuable, terrible, or delightful things that a human being can experience. Such experiences have their value, but if they're admixed with illusions and errors, then they keep us in the constraints of various herd metaphysical essentialisms. In fact, for Nietzsche, the hard metaphysician is an unwitting victim of collective illusions which cause us to take appearances as realities, especially if those appearances are oversaturated with our fantasies about how we would like the world to be. Like in Hegel, Nietzsche as well acknowledges that philosophy and religion fulfill profound spiritual needs. Quote, a philosophy can be employed either to satisfy such spiritual needs or to set them aside. To effect a transition here, to relieve the heart overladen with feelings, it is much more useful to employ art. So, unlike Hegel, Nietzsche's brilliant move here, that when faced with the truths of science, art can become a valid substitute for religion and for speculative philosophy. The actual, as opposed to merely Hegelian scientific spirit's rise to dominance, means there is again a new and valuable function for art, that is to be a substitute for outmoded religions and philosophies. And driving home the point, from art it will be easier to go over to a truly liberating philosophical science. Although soon in Human All Too Human, Nietzsche will wonder if, contrary to this, art is in a process of fading away. The art that is fading away is by and large the art allied with traditional metaphysics and religion. Here, already in Aphorism 27, Nietzsche is clear: the truly liberating philosophical science now dawning in our age is in need of a new art. And art and science can now go hand in hand like never before. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari will take up this point explicitly in their chapters on art and aesthetics in the late work What is Philosophy, which I recommend. Nietzsche's remarks here are, I believe, correct and quite prophetic. For him, there is still a powerful role to be played by art as a simulacra and a free play space for exploring religious and spiritual experiences and feelings, without, however, subscribing to the content of religious and philosophical doctrines. And art in this way is more compatible with science than it is with religion or speculative philosophy. Furthermore, art is still valuable because it soothes and heals, but only provisionally and only for a moment. Here Nietzsche begins again to sound his suspicions about art in general. Although it may have a hopeful function and role to play in the transition to a scientific worldview, it also, as the simulacra of traditional religion and philosophy, has the potential to be a dangerous drug. That is a palliative and a narcotizing of human suffering which inhibits action and draws human beings back into reliance on false pictures of the world rather than inspiring their clear-headed action and self-transformation. Here we begin to see a divergence of two basic types of art, one consistent with the theme of philosophical liberation, and the other a cave in which the shadows of God are still shown on the cave wall for 1,000 years. Nietzsche's remarks on art and aesthetics in Human All Too Human will tend to emphasize the deceptive nature of art and its dangerousness. Although before too long, as we'll see, art will also come to be on the ascendancy again within the themes of self-overcoming and self-transfiguration. Far from seeing scientific naturalism and realism as a potentially damaging and reductive view of the world, Nietzsche avows that naturalism and realism are just now at the end of the 19th century and still also in 2021, becoming fruitful and dynamic fields of inquiry, resisting scientific reductionism and holding great potential for life enhancement. This new dynamic scientific naturalism and realism, which is disclosing the true nature of the world, will eventually, with perfect equanimity, be able to situate human life within the physiology and the history of the evolution of organisms and concepts. Artistic activity, however, in regards to this new world disclosed by science, has a strong potential to become retrogressive, atavistic, self-deceptive, and anti-realist. Art's contribution to the new scientific Weltanschauung, in other words, is its ongoing exemplification of forms of human life and human self-understanding which are historically retrogressive, and so have the character of an archaeological exhibit of sorts. Here, Nietzsche doesn't seem to note the possibility of a futurist art which might at the same time preserve the past and keep up with paradigms in the new sciences. The conflict here between science and art, between the future and the past, is however a real one and precipitates a moment of decision. In Aphorism 29, drunk with the odor of blossoms, we read, "The closer one gets to the true nature of the world and to knowledge of it, this we do in fact through science. But we continue to think that we do so even more through art and religion." Art and religion are, to be sure, blossoms of the world, but they are certainly not closer to the roots of the world than the stem is, the stem here being science, of course. Art and religion provide us with no better understanding of the nature of things at all, although almost everyone believes they do. The basis of the power of art and religion is for Nietzsche error or deception. But error is not simply something bad. It is error that has made mankind so profound, tender, and inventive so as to produce such flowers as the arts and the religions. Pure knowledge, science, or the stem would have been incapable of this. And anyone who unveiled to us the true nature of the world would produce for all of us the most unpleasant disappointment. It is the world as idea, as error, that is so full of significance for human life. The aesthetic, religious, or philosophical idea is profound, marvelous, and bears in its womb all happiness and unhappiness. In a way, emerging from the unconscious into history, art, religion, and philosophy are not only the blossoms, but also the root. However, in regards to the stem, which is science, the thing that makes it all work, what they provide for us is only secondary, that is, illusory qualities, not the primary ones. Analysis such as these in Nietzsche are timely rather than untimely in our own era. For example, much of later 20th century continental philosophy still harbor prejudices and suspicions about the value of science, which recent thinkers like Catherine Malabou, herself informed by the earlier Michel Serres, work against in their attempt to again bring philosophical thinking into dialogue with the latest research in the sciences, such as the concept of plasticity in neurobiology. Science is still very much the stem, or the stem cells we might quip, without which art, religion, and philosophy are doomed to retrogressiveness, rather than the attainment of the cultural regeneration they've always sought. Previous art, religion, and philosophy incorporated errors and deceptions in accordance with a process which Nietzsche now analyzes of appearance becoming being. The profession of almost every man, even that of the artist, begins with hypocrisy, with an imitation from without, with a copying of what is most effective, that is, in a mimetic adaptation to appearances. He who is always wearing a mask of a friendly countenance must finally acquire a power over benevolent moods without which the impression of friendliness cannot be obtained. And finally, these acquire power over him. He is benevolent. The appearance of benevolence, or all the other fundamental values in art, religion, and philosophy, have become what they are now through a dynamic imitative process which cannot be separated from illusion, error, hypocrisy, and copying. What this means for Nietzsche, in other words, is that we are mimetic beings who cannot, in the long run, fully escape all of our aesthetic and metaphysical anthropomorphisms and illusions. For this Nietzsche, only the scientific spirit makes an honest attempt. Although, alas, it could never hope to fully set us on the path of truth, or the way of truth as opposed to the way of appearance or illusion in Parmenides' sense. We're just far too limited as beings to be able to fully incorporate the coming regimes of scientific honesty. And from here, Nietzsche transitions into his analysis of art and religion as drugs or pharmakon, themselves involved in a twofold struggle between, on the one hand, truth and the other, error or illusion. Quote, religion and art and metaphysical philosophy, too, endeavor to bring about a change of sensibility, partly through changing our judgment as to the nature of our experience, for example, with the proposition, whom God loveth, he chastiseth, certainly a change in the moral sensibility of humanity from the Bible on, and partly through awakening the ability to take pleasure in pain and in emotion in general. And this is the task from which the art of tragedy takes its starting point. The worry about religion and art as drugs or pharmakon is that, quote, the more a man inclines towards reinterpretation through these means, the less attention he will give to the cause of the ill and to doing away with it. The momentary amelioration and narcotizing, such as is normally employed, for example, in the case of a toothache, comes to suffice us in the case of more serious sufferings as well. Remember Goethe, at the moment of highest bliss and deepest distress, we need the artist? At those moments, we also, of course, need religion and speculative metaphysics. But all these spheres are powerfully enticing drugs which, once we start taking them, we can scarcely do without them. And we thereby dull the force of our pain and suffering, which, if it were experienced purely without these anesthetics, we might actually learn to do something about. Again, Nietzsche sounds a note of optimism in regards to the future of religion and art. Quote, the more the domination of the religions and all the arts of narcosis declines, the stricter attention men pay to the actual abolition of the ill, which is, to be sure, a bad outlook for the writers of tragedy, for there is less and less material for tragedy because the realm of inexorable, implacable destiny is growing narrower and narrower. But an even worse one for the priests, for these have hitherto lived on the narcotizing of human ills. The idea that the metamorphosis of philosophy into science can eventually rid us of the material for tragedy in our lives, one of the most progressive and optimistic thoughts that Nietzsche ever had. But are narcotizing philosophy, religion, and art really on the decline? And can we affirm their regeneration and return within a new scientific optimism? It's hard not to hope for this outcome, although we clearly still have a very long way to go to get there. On what has been taken to be truth in religion and art, Nietzsche, I believe, here indirectly targets the Generomantics studied last week, at the same time situating them within the entire history of religion, theology, philosophy, and art. Every religion, he avers, was born out of fear and need. A thesis he may have gotten here from Feuerbach. It has crept into existence along the path of aberrations of reason. Once, perhaps, when imperiled by science, it lyingly introduced some philosophical teaching or other into its system. Having introduced this little bit of philosophical reasoning, aka theology, the religion or philosophical theology later acted like the reason had been there all the time. But this is the theologian's artifice from the time when a religion is already doubting itself. These artifices of theology were, to be sure, already practiced very early. That is, already earlier than late antiquity and even earlier than Plato. And all this is what has led to the superstition of the sensus allegoricus. That is, the idea of the book of nature and everything within it, especially human beings, as suffused with divine signs and reflecting a divine origin. An allegory of the spirit or of God to be read in nature. This, in turn, became the habit of most all of the philosophers. And especially those half-creatures, the poetizing philosophers and philosophizing artists. Here, for example, in the Generomantics, the project of a fusion of poetry and philosophy and art is itself a symptom of religious yearning, the attempt to fulfill religious needs in the age of decline of religion. And so these poetizing philosophers or philosophizing artists began to treat all sensations, the communal sensorium or sensus allegoricus of nature, as if they were fundamental qualities of mankind in general, and from there to permit their own religious sensations too to exert a significant influence on the intellectual structure of their systems. And this is, we can note, precisely what the high point of German idealism, Hegel and Schelling, accomplished. A perfect fusion of sense and spirit, oriented by and large from religion or art or mythology, and so closing in on itself over and against a philosophy of nature that might have had a genuinely scientific starting point. This is a pretty cool analysis of the phenomena of truth in religion and art. And I have to admit that when I read poetizing philosophers or philosophizing artists, what I find interesting in them, and even seductive, is precisely the way in which truth remains one and univocal across the domains of religion, philosophy, and art. For Nietzsche, this mode of thought is biased from the get-go in favor of religion, and the constructed truths of revealed religions. Art and philosophy tending to simply reinforce the theologian's artifice in again making religion palatable and seductive for us. All of this is only possible, however, in an era where religion is already doubting itself, which is a good way to explain not only the Generomantics, but also the rise of Neoplatonic and Christian philosophy in late antiquity. We don't have to like Nietzsche's points to acknowledge that he has a good point here. However, before too long, we hear something even more interesting. Namely that artists in themselves are not essentially religious. According to Nietzsche, the phenomena artist and the heights of art is essentially an irreligious phenomena. Art flourishes, in other words, only when religious doctrine has already been so thoroughly incorporated that it can be treated lightly and with personal style. Brilliantly, Nietzsche brings this way of understanding the irreligiosity of artists back to Homer, quote, "Homer is so much at home among his gods, and as a poet takes such pleasure in them, that he at any rate must have been profoundly unreligious. With that with which popular belief presented him, a paltry, crude, in part horrible superstition, and the Greek myths that Homer celebrates are indeed pretty horrible, he trafficked as freely as a sculptor with his clay, that is to say, with the same ease and impartiality as that possessed by Aeschylus or Aristophanes, and which in more recent times distinguishes the great artists of the Renaissance as it does Shakespeare and Goethe. For consummate, fully achieved artists, like in this shortlist, it does seem pretty clear that not piety but beautification is their animating drive. Next, we get Nietzsche's deep analysis of art as a force of false interpretation. All the visions, terrors, and states of exhaustion and rapture experienced by the saint, for example, are pathological conditions, which, on the basis of rooted religious and psychological errors, he only interprets quite differently, that is to say, not as illnesses. It is not otherwise with the madness and ravings of prophets and oracular priests. It is always the degree of knowledge, imagination, exertion, morality in the head and heart of the interpreters that has made so much of them. Recall how Plato in the Phaedrus had defined prophetic or mantic mania as a gift from the gods? A divine blessing rather than a pathological form of madness? And how in general, Plato took the oracles and divination practices of the prophets and the priests seriously? For Nietzsche's keen genealogical analysis, this was clearly on account of their forcefulness and cannot be explained as true interpretations from the muses and the gods. And so on down through the ages, for those men called geniuses and saints, to produce their greatest effects, they have to have constrained to their side interpreters who, for the good of mankind, misunderstand them. There is, in other words, a generous and an ungenerous way of interpreting these primordial religious phenomena, and the generous way must be rethought as a life-enhancing misunderstanding. And so in Aphorism 127 on the reverence for madness we hear, because it was noticed that a state of excitement often made the head clearer and called up happy inspirations, it was believed that through the extremest states of excitement, one would participate in the happiest of inspirations. And thus the mad were revered as the wise and propounders of oracles. What lies at the bottom of this is a false conclusion. If your worldview is such that divine madness really exists for you, and many a theologian has in the 20th century gone this route, such as Joseph Piper's Divine Madness, Plato's case against secular humanism, then of course Nietzsche's worry about the revelational character of inspiration will leave you cold. It's still a powerful analysis of the reverence for divine madness, however. So who was right here, Plato or Nietzsche? Probably the only way to figure that out is to undergo a divine inspiration yourself. And it's not like we can accuse Nietzsche here of not having done so. About his own experience of inspiration, he writes in Ecce Homo, a stunning phenomenology of poetic inspiration, which seems very much to flirt with its divine origin, while at the same time speaking in the language of physiology. Here, as elsewhere, Nietzsche is a bundle of contradictions and paradoxes. So all the aphorisms studied so far were crucial points where topics of art and aesthetics were situated by Nietzsche in the earlier parts of the work and within his emergent project for scientific naturalism. Let's turn now to Book 4 of Human All Too Human from the Souls of Artists and Writers, which is the piece assigned in the course pack this week. This is a crucially important chapter in Nietzsche's overall philosophy of art. In fact, it's the first time since the birth of tragedy which promised a science of aesthetics, that Nietzsche is explicitly writing a work in the genre of philosophy of art, with the possible exception of the untimely meditation, Richard Wagner in Bayreuth. All the other writings from the birth of tragedy to here often concern art, but never so frontally and systematically. In fact, while all Nietzsche's later writings as well very often concern art, and are sometimes like the gay science or Thus Spoke Zarathustra, explicitly pitched as works of art in themselves, Book 4 of Human All Too Human remains, despite its aphoristic form, the only place in all of the middle and later Nietzsche where we get something resembling a treatise on art and aesthetics. The closest thing to this degree of rigor and comprehensiveness in the later Nietzsche are the Will to Power as Art notebooks, based on planned drafts for the work, variously titled, but in that case Nietzsche's remarks on art were cobbled together and published posthumously. So in a very real sense, Book 4 of Human All Too Human is the treatise beyond the birth of tragedy that Nietzsche wrote on art and aesthetics. It's strange in light of this how little it's treated in Nietzsche studies, or in general survey courses on the philosophy of art. We certainly can't cover all 81 of its tightly interlocking aphorisms here, but for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll try to summarize what I take to be the main outcome of this book for the Middle Nietzschean philosophy of art and aesthetics. First, some basic points of the work, and these we can consider the basic theses of the Middle Nietzsche on art and aesthetics. Art, in a diluted form, can ease our withdrawal symptoms from religion and morality, but it can't satisfy our deepest metaphysical needs. This sounds a bit like Hegel minus the spirit higher than nature part. Art can assist in the affirmation of life and improve the self-love and self-valuing of the free spirit. Art can enable us to enjoy religious feelings and experiences without responsibility to their conceptual contents, is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which can make us weep in religious ecstasy without, however, signaling a return to religious precepts. Next, although it has tended to do this historically, art should not attempt to make sacred, and we should not make sacred or ontologize our romantic imagination and deepest feelings. The artist should not be treated like a priest or prophet or within the modern cult of genius. Rather, what art should provide is an optics of life. That being a very sketchy or schematic outline of the main theses of this book, let's look at some of the aphorisms themselves. It begins with aphorism 145, what is perfect is supposed not to have become. In the case of everything perfect, we are accustomed to abstain from asking how it became. We rejoice in the present fact as though it came out of the ground by magic. Here we are probably still standing under the after effect of a primeval mythological invention. We still almost feel, for example, in a Greek temple, such as that at Paestum. This was Heidegger's example last week, you'll remember, that a god must one morning have playfully constructed his dwelling out of these tremendous weights. At other times, that a stone suddenly acquired by magic a soul that is now trying to speak out of it. For Nietzsche, such magical dwelling in mythological illusion is the effect of art that leads to our attribution of perfection. And it does seem that Heidegger, like we saw last week, still thinks in the domain of being here, the poetic dwelling of the god, the stone that speaks in the media of the earth, and has not yet sufficiently, in the Nietzschean sense, looked to the process of becoming. The great work of art stands in being and the truth of being, where becoming is only underway, into the basic experience of truth in art. For Nietzsche, such an approach to the temple at Paestum is delusory, as are, we might add, Heidegger's remarks in a similar vein in the context of his travel logs, sojourns to Greece. On the effects of art, Nietzsche goes on to note that the artist knows his work produces its full effect when it excites a belief in improvisation, a belief that it came into being with miraculous suddenness, and so he may assist this illusion and introduce those elements of rapturous restlessness, of blindly groping disorder, of attentive revelry that attend the beginning of creation into his art as a means of deceiving the soul of the spectator or auditor into a mood in which he believes that the complete and perfect has suddenly emerged instantaneously. This version of divine inspiration or miraculous suddenness, it goes without saying, is what the proper science of art should definitely counter. The free spirit will not bow down to the artist as before a god, and the more circumspect science of art should assist us in diminishing our illusions, bad habits, and false conclusions when faced with the power of art. Science should teach us to separate cognitive contents from the strength and profundity of our feelings. A fairly simple analytic philosophy point indeed. On the artist's sense of truth, we hear, very much in accord with Plato's Republic, that in regards to knowledge of truths, the artist possesses a weaker morality than the thinker. The artist does not wish to be deprived of the glittering, profound interpretations of life, and he guards against simple methods and results. Almost seeming to import himself into the perspective of the tragic poet, Nietzsche goes on in wonderful gratitude to the artist. He appears to be fighting on behalf of the greater dignity and significance of man. In reality, the artist refuses to give up the presuppositions which are most efficacious for his art. That is to say, the fantastic, mythical, uncertain, and extreme, the sense for the symbolic, the overestimation of the person, and the belief in something miraculous and genius. The artist thus considers his mode of creation more important than scientific devotion to the true in any form. The artist's sense of truth is, in other words, against truth, fundamentally constituted by a will to deception with its artistic effects. And this is what makes art and Nietzsche's erstwhile devotion to art so problematic and interesting. For the artist we hear next is a necromancer. Ooh, this sounds scary and cool. Because one of the duties of art is conserving the past and taking extinguished, faded ideas and restoring them to color. Technicolor necromancer, go Nietzsche. When the artist performs this task, he winds a band around different ages and makes the spirit that informed them return. Again, art exhibits the archaeology of the spirit, and like in Hegel, is essentially a phenomena of the past, like the ghost of the father to Hamlet, or the wonderful sorcerer exiled from Plato's Callipolis. The artist presents us with a phantom life, like that which appears around graves or in the return of the beloved dead in dreams. The oldest emotions are aroused, but again, only for a few moments. And the heart beats to rhythms it had forgotten. Custodian of the dead and gone, art as necromancy performs a very useful function. And of course, the artist is forgivable if he doesn't stand in the foremost ranks of the Enlightenment. Nietzsche is not advocating that the art of the future will be somehow up to date with science, for that would deprive art of its chief function, which is necromancy. And no wonder, as a consequence, that we must still be suspicious of art, for the artist in relation to the scientist is as a child, or a youth all his life, a world child playing with acorns, and a necromancer. And through this belief in revivifying ghosts or spirits of the past, the artist's task becomes that of making all of humanity more childlike. This is his glory, and this his limitation. I don't think I completely agree with you here, Nietzsche, but that is a wonderfully vivid self-portrait and takedown of Wagner at the same time. Why this obsession throughout this book with poets as backwards-looking creatures, who we employ only as bridges to distant ages and conceptions, to dead and dying religions and cultures? Well, probably because the artists with which Nietzsche is most familiar, enamored, and trying to liberate himself from, he considers as employing techniques which are violent and intoxicating assaults upon us. In contrast to this, Nietzsche recommends the noblest kind of beauty which has a slow arrow, that is, slow burn beauty, as opposed to artistic delirium. For the essence of art, rather than being an expressive vehicle of religious feeling, raises its head where religion relaxes its hold. And here sounding very Goethean, as beautification requires shadow, so clarification requires vagueness. This is a theme we'll see in French symbolist aesthetics soon enough. Art makes the sight of life bearable by laying over it the veil of unclear thinking. Remember Goethe, beauty can never be clear about itself? And Kant's indeterminate concept of beauty? Again, here in Nietzsche, beauty is mysterious and plays in its own kind of chiaroscuro and tenebrism. Chiaroscuro casting shadow and light in stark relief, tenebrism engulfing figures in the shade. Against praise for the art of the beautiful soul, Nietzsche next notes that the art of the ugly soul is in fact responsible for the mightiest effects of art, for it is the art born of ugliness which tames souls, moves stones, and humanizes the beast. Art is so powerful that even the thinker and scientist are hardly capable of getting beyond the metaphysical need for art. Enchanted by art's trickery, a passage in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony will make him feel he is hovering above the earth in a dome of stars with the dream of immortality in his heart, rather than given to the storm and stress, the rush of ecstasy. Nietzsche sees Beethoven's Ninth as the moment when his intellectual probity is put to the test. Just as he still needs the Ninth, the Greeks needed Homeric fantasy to soothe their passions. enhance their subtlety, and break from life's tragedies. Life embellished with lies and art, life as a game, was necessary to those Greeks. And they got so good at telling tall tales that neighboring nations were no doubt reduced to despair by them. The silly or childish Greeks, as the Egyptians sometimes called them. Yes, artists tend to believe in inspirations like rays of divine grace, but in reality, the best in the artist is his power of judgment, methodically put into practice, as in Beethoven's notebooks, which reveals his meticulous editorial process. Great improvisation can occur, but is inferior to careful craft, hard work, and meticulous organizing. And when great inspirations do occur, they are a spending of accumulated capital, not gifts fallen from the sky. For Nietzsche, the genius of knowledge or science suffers more than the genius of art, but is less whingy about it. We should be suspicious of all artists' claim to martyrdom for the suffering existence of a nation or people. The truly great artist is cosmopolitan, not nationalistic. However, such greatness in art, as in the case of Goethe, incites vainer natures to extreme imitation. It puts lesser talents in the shadows. And so the best thing that can happen is when geniuses appear together and restrain each other, since then even the weaker and tender natures too will usually be granted air and light. How sweet, perhaps a little appreciation for Jena there as opposed to Weimar. Again, and loosely referring to the rise of so-called decadent art in his own day, art can very often be atavistic, regressive, or dangerous, insofar as it is animated by sudden excitations, gods, demons, or the soul in nature, as well as a hatred for science and everything unfavorable to art. At times, the artist indeed becomes pitted against society like a spoiled child. When this happens, Nietzsche speaks of the artist halted in youth and childhood, gradually retrogressing to earlier states of the soul, and at last living and dying in melancholia. Nietzsche next and again connects the artist to stunted development and points to myths concerning how Homer and Aeschylus died in melancholia. As to the depiction of characters in works of literature, we like to admire their complexity, and should admit to ourselves that in regards to real human beings, characters in art are almost invariably depicted superficially. Through the novel, we learn to treat phantasms as actual, necessary humans, which displays our natural ignorance of mankind, both bodily and as regards to character. I imagine this was penned before Nietzsche's encounter with Dostoevsky. That a work of art works powerfully upon us is no testament to its quality. Who in the realm of the plastic art of sculpture, Nietzsche asks, has moved and enraptured us more than Bernini? But is Bernini not among the flashiest of sculptors, always going for the most powerful effects? If we have faith in this type of art, this often justifies our faith in ourselves for appreciating it. But should we not be a bit more self-aware of our vanity here? Let's be honest, we worship genius on account of our vanity, and usually imagine ourselves capable of producing a painting like one of Raphael's or a dramatic scene like one of Shakespeare's. And we go on to justify our metaphysical hopes on the basis of presentiments, such as when we find in the glance of Raphael's Madonna the whole sure evangel. Most often, our vanity and self-love promotes the cult of genius, but we also like genius to be a miracle, something inaccessibly above us, lest the artist at the same time aggrieve our vanity. Quote, even Goethe, who was without envy, called Shakespeare his star of the most distant heights. The stars, these we do not desire. Far from being divine, the genius is just a very focused individual. The counter-notion, like in Plato's Ion that the genius is a creature of divine intuition, is another one of those pleasant superstitions we nurture on account of our vanity. When we call someone divine, we mean, here there's no need to compete with them. And the closer we look into how art became, the cooler our value judgment becomes in regards to it. Next, Nietzsche gives some practical advice, kind of like Rilke's letters to a young poet to aspiring artists. If you want to become an artist, stop beginning from a vision of the whole. Instead, focus on the recipe. Art is less about natural talent than it is about being tireless in collecting and refining the relevant materials day and night. 10 years later, you might find you've stitched together something of value. The opposite notion that a god takes root in the brain of a genius is above all dangerous to the genius himself, for he is eventually assailed by awe of himself. Like a Caesar or Napoleon, his head swims, he begins to act out of his semi-insanity, and unclarity in regards to himself, eventually losing his good qualities and hastening his destruction. Sometimes Nietzsche admits, and as Plato had taught, a little madness brings the greatest blessing, but only if it can be held together in the individual, which is extremely rare. The genius who comes to believe in his own divinity takes poison, grows old, loses energy, resoluteness, courage, and method. One of the best tasks for future art, in its mission from the past, Nietzsche imagines, is to compensate for the deliverances of fate. For evil chances occur in the lives of great artists, for example, compelling a painter to leave his finest picture in the form of mere hurried sketches, or which compelled Beethoven to leave behind for us only unsatisfactory piano arrangements of what might have become many a great sonata. Here the artist coming after ought to try posthumously to amend the life of the master. A master of orchestration can waken to life for us a symphony, which lies in the artist's notebook only in the death trance of the piano. I'm not sure how often in Nietzsche's days conductors and composers were putting these recommendations into practice, but I doubt very much. Not only unfinished sonatas of Beethoven can be revivified historically or futurely in this way, but of all the great composers. My personal favorite piece of music had its genesis when a professor took Bach's Giaconda, Partita in D minor, for solo violin and built around it various choral themes hidden in the music. This might have remained a mere scholarly discovery if Christoph Poppern hadn't gotten the bright idea of taking the professor's discoveries off of the library's shelves and placing it triumphantly in the concert hall. Let's use that as a cue to switch the music from Beethoven's Ninth to this wonderful work, which indirectly takes up Nietzsche's advice. On Thought in Poetry, we hear that the poet conducts his thoughts festively, in the carriage of rhythm, usually because they are incapable of walking on foot. Haha, what a witty quip by a philosopher against poetry. Following this theme, many writers who are unable to express their thoughts with clarity will take pleasure in employing the strongest, most exaggerated designations and superlatives, thus producing a light effect like torches flaring on confused forest pathways. Definitely a stretch, but this aphorism reminds me a lot of Heidegger's poetry. Nietzsche's own aesthetic preference is for books that teach one to dance. There are writers who, by representing the impossible as possible and speaking of morality and genius as though both were merely a matter of wanting them, a mere whim and caprice, evoke a feeling of high-spirited freedom, as though man were standing on tiptoe and compelled to dance for sheer joy. At the end of this lecture, we'll look at Nietzsche's two most involved aphorisms on the dance, which was certainly his own ideal in the realm of philosophy and of art. Against the myth that artists are men of great passion, a theme he also picks up in the last notebooks, we hear that though artists often pretend to be men of great passion, they are very often the voice of experience, depicting the passions and sensations of others. For example, Homer and his Achilles. In order to produce the illusion of great passion, one has only to let oneself go, abandon self-control, give rein to anger or desire, and all the world cries how passionate he is. However, deep-rooted passion, which gnaws at the individual and consumes him, is a thing of some consequence. He who experiences these passions certainly does not describe them in dramas, music, or novels. They're too personal. When artists do become unbridled individuals, to this extent they cease to be artists and become something else entirely. Here and throughout Human All Too Human, Nietzsche seems oddly to be siding again and again with Plato against Aristotle. In Aphorism 212, are fear and pity really discharged by tragedy as Aristotle taught? And do ghost stories really make one less fearful and superstitious? First, he notes that unlike erotic passion, fear and pity are not affects that actually need to be relieved. And next, that even granted that they do, their effect and power of the soul only grows greater through being evoked and discharged in tragic art. Quote, Plato might still be right in saying that through tragedy one becomes generally more fearful and emotional. The tragic poet would then acquire a gloomy, disheartened view of the world, a soft, susceptible, tearful soul, enthralled to ever greater unbridledness and immoderation. Next, having just completely agreed with Plato in the Republic, Nietzsche inserts a caveat, but what right has our age to offer an answer to Plato's great question concerning the moral influence of art at all? Even if we possessed art, what influence of any kind does it exercise among us? This is one of the many questions in Human All Too Human that's aged pretty well, I'd say. Do we possess art? Do you even know if we possess art? How many connoisseurs of really great art today do you know? And even if there were a ton, and you could name many great names, what influence does this great art have on your everyday life? On Eros and the aphrodisiac drive in art, just speaks of art's enhancement of reality. The fact that men saw in the aphrodisiac drive a divinity and felt its operation with reverential gratitude has in the course of time saturated that affect, namely Eros, with a series of exalted notions that actually greatly ennobled it. This is the invention of the modern concept of love among the troubadours, the Italian poets, and so on. This next remark reveals Nietzsche's philological genius in regards to the Greek character and Greek art. Those noble people of art who Winckelmann admired for their simplicity, harmony, and balance, or Apollonian art, were in fact, in Nietzsche's Dionysian or pessimistic reading, suffering from great nervous epidemics. And from this they fashioned for themselves the glorious art type of the Bacchant, the arts of Dionysus. Quote, "For the Greeks were certainly not possessed of a square and solid healthiness. Their secret was to honor even sickness as a god if only it had power." This is a remark much ahead of its time in classical studies. And even today, scholars, when they study the Greek mysteries or the Dionysic poet Nonnus, are just catching up with this. One of the very coolest aspects of Nietzsche's aesthetics is its connection to his philosophy of language. I did my master's thesis on how the art of dance fits in here, so I'll be very brief. When Nietzsche was very young and just getting his qualification as a classical philologist, he studied extensively the pioneering philosophies of language of his day, especially Rousseau and Herder's famous essays on the philosophy of language, but widening also to include more or less every text written in this area from Plato's Cratylus to his own day. These reflections came to constitute the crucible, or background scholarship, out of which his theory of the Apollonian and the Dionysian were developed, and his most specialized and longest lectures at the University of Basel, still untranslated, concerned precisely the reconstruction of Greek musicae in terms of how the elements of music, gesture, and word are configured within it. Here we get a summary of what is a much deeper archaeological project within Nietzsche's studies. First, and returning to his earlier view on music before being enchanted by Wagner and Schopenhauer's aesthetics, we hear that music is, of and in itself, not so significant for our inner world. This is so un-Nietzschean that it's hard to believe it's his more considered view. Nevertheless, it's very well attested both prior to his youthful enthusiasms and here in his modernist sobering up. Nor is music so profoundly exciting that it can be said to count as the immediate language of feeling, a point he himself belabored in the first draft of The Birth of Tragedy, the Dionysic worldview. Music's primeval union with poetry has deposited so much symbolism into rhythmic movement, into the varying strength and volume of musical sounds, that we now suppose it to speak directly to the inner world and to come from the inner world. Music, in other words, has been so spiritualized by language that we now hear it as a language all its own, instrumental music shorn of word. The root of this capacity to hear significance in music is not, however, in the first instance in language, logos, or the word, as the Greek philosophers taught, but rather in gesture. Older than language is the mimicking of gestures, which takes place involuntarily and is even now, when the language of gesture is universally restrained, that we cannot see a mobile face without an innervation in our own face. The imitated gesture is the true origin of language, and it leads us back to the sensation which it expresses in the face and body of the person imitated. Nietzsche's theory of language is in short a gestural semiology, which accounts for how conceptual meaning in language and subsequently music got going in the first place. As soon as the meaning of gestures were understood, a symbolism of gesture could arise. I mean, a sign language of sounds could be so agreed that at first one produced sound and gesture, to which it was symbolically joined, later only sound. This is the origin of the idea of absolute music and also meaning. That language is originally sign or gesture language is a fact well understood by anyone who's immersed themselves in foreign languages or learned to speak sign. Nietzsche's main interest here is on how all of our cultural forms have been gradually desensualized. That is, modern life has taken on an intellectual character over and against the sensual or aesthetic. And this point is well exemplified in the history of the fine arts, from Greek musicae, which still privileged the gestural or sonorous, as well as the dance, versus our modern art forms, which tend to be about significance and meaning, All our senses have become blunted. We've lost the continuity of aesthetic education. This is a fact betrayed by, for example, the complete dominance of the well-tempered tonal system. Nietzsche asks, what will be the consequence of all this? The answer is nothing short of a devaluation of our embodied existence. The more capable of thought, eye, and ear become, the closer they approach the point at which they become unsensual. Pleasure is transferred to the brain. The sense organs themselves grow blunt and feeble. The symbolic increasingly replaces simple being, i.e., bodily being. And along this path, we thus attain to barbarism as certainly as along any other. While Nietzsche certainly didn't live to see the rise of the digital age, computers, the internet, iPhones, and in the last year, online learning, he would doubtless see all these developments as having produced a culture in which all intellectual and artistic activity has been spiritualized to such an extreme degree that the body hardly plays any role at all. Exercise over here and language and culture over there. If you're interested in Nietzsche's philological discoveries here, Thrasybulus Georgiadis powerfully develops Nietzsche's core insights on the nature of language and the difference between ancient and modern musical aesthetics, although only 2 of his books have been translated, one on the reconstruction of ancient Greek performance art, and the other on the consequences of decentralization in the rise of Western or classical music, as exemplified in the Mass. The other big consequence of these developments for our aesthetic existence, and one which I think we can all relate to, is that the world has become uglier than ever. At the same time, more beautiful than it ever has been. However, the more attenuated the fragrant odor of significance becomes, the fewer there will be still able to perceive it. The rest will finally be left with the ugly, which they will try to enjoy directly, an endeavor in which they are bound to fail. And thus there is, in the Germany of Nietzsche's day, a twofold musical evolution. On the one hand, art seeking to outdo itself in ever higher and more refined demands, and on the other, the enormous majority, growing every year more and more incapable of comprehending the meaningful, and therefore learning to seize with greater and greater contentment the ugly and disgusting in itself. That is to say, the basely sensual in music. Nietzsche's remarks here certainly have a worrisomely aristocratic flavor, and yet, as a testament to what happens to the beauty of spirit in conditions of popularization, his analysis is still interesting. Just think of the recent history of popular music. Next, Nietzsche explains why we no longer understand architecture. This is again not an issue with only an esoterically Nietzschean relevance. A recent Arch Daily article, "What is beauty in architecture today, and are we afraid of it?" The article answers that yes, we are, and this is something that Nietzsche well explains. Everything in a Greek or Christian building originally signified something, and indeed something of a higher order of things. A feeling of inexhaustible significance lay about the building like a magical veil. Beauty entered this system only incidentally, without encroaching upon the fundamental sense of the uncanny and the exalted, of consecration by magic and proximity of the divine. At most, beauty mitigated the dread. But this dread was everywhere the presupposition. Beauty entered into our architectural experience precisely in order to mitigate the sublime. But what is the beauty of a building to us today? To our aesthetic experience, great architecture has something mask-like about it. We simply don't experience it aesthetically in the way our ancestors did. Drawing towards his conclusions, Nietzsche sounds a somber note on what the beyond in art was versus what art means to us today. It is not without profound sorrow that one admits to oneself that in their highest flights, the artists of all ages have raised to heavenly transfiguration precisely those conceptions which we now recognize as false. Artists were the glorifiers of the religious and philosophical errors of mankind. They could not have been so without believing in the absolute truth of those errors. If belief in such truth declines in general, if the rainbow colors at the extreme limits of human knowledge can grow pale, that species of art can never flourish again which, like the Divine Commedia, the pictures of Raphael, the frescoes of Michelangelo, the Gothic cathedral, presupposes not only a cosmic but also a metaphysical significance in the objects of art. A moving tale will one day be told about how there once existed such an art, such an artist's faith. I think it's fair to say here that the laboratory for Nietzsche's idea of the death of God, which he communicates only a few books later in The Gay Science, and which is far from a celebratory but rather a mournful idea, that this most famous notion in all of Nietzsche's writings has its genesis and laboratory in his reflections on art and human all too human. Following this lament, the longest aphorism in Book 4 covers in much greater detail than Schlegel's dialogue on poetry, and minus the Francophobia, the modern history of poetry from the French dramatists and Voltaire, through the German Lessing, who imported French form into German drama, and through Schiller and Goethe, who did what they could to Greekify German, despite the fact that their language versus the French language put them at a great disadvantage in the task. Since the time of this great revolution in poetry and the demigods of German literature, Schiller and Goethe, and far from the renewal of literature hoped for by the German Romantics, the modern spirit with its restlessness has come to seek power in every domain and has established an era more interested in positivism and logic than in the nuances of artistic moderation. It is these emerging social conditions to which Nietzsche traces the rise of decadence in German poetry. This concept of decadence is going to be crucial to the later 19th century and early 20th century philosophy of art. Its meaning in Nietzsche's thought is both what is decaying, leading to an end or the death of art, as well as a literal decadencing, that is, an evaporation of the musicality of the human soul, which leads it to need and to produce great art. In place of rhythm, harmony, and cadence, quote, one has indeed thrown off the unreasonable fetters of Franco-Hellenic art, but without noticing, it has accustomed oneself to finding all fetters, all limitations unreasonable. And thus art moves towards its dissolution, and in doing so ranges, which is extremely instructive to be sure, through all the phases of its beginnings, its childhood, its imperfection, its former hazardous enterprises and extravagances. In going down to destruction, it interprets its birth and becoming. Lord Byron once said, "So far as poetry is concerned, the more I reflect on it, the more firmly am I convinced that we are all on the wrong path, every one of us. We all pursue a revolutionary system inwardly false. Our own and the next generation will arrive at the same conviction." For Nietzsche, the situation has progressed far beyond the point at which we might urge a return to the models. To Dante or Shakespeare, for instance, the social conditions in which we are enmeshed simply makes this kind of art impossible. And we can see Nietzsche here wrestling mournfully with the end of classical art, especially when he asks, does the mature artistic insight that Goethe achieved in the second half of his life not at bottom say exactly the same thing? This art, as Goethe later understood it, as the Greeks and yes, the French practiced it, are not these highest achievements of art still in some sense futural, waiting to be discovered? What now is left of art, Nietzsche poses in the form of a parable. Supposing our visible world were only appearance, as the metaphysicians assume, then art would come to stand quite close to the real world, which sounds an awful lot like the Hegelian analysis of art but with a twist, for there would then be only too much similarity between the world of appearance and the illusory world of the artist. Here for Nietzsche, art is not true appearing so much as appearing as such. This might indeed serve to elevate the significance of art above the significance of nature, because art would represent the uniform, the types, and the prototypes of nature. Sounds pretty good, right? Can't this be what's left of art? Nope, sorry. These presuppositions are, however, false, but after such knowledge, what place still remains for art? Well, it's probably more than fair to point out here that art has taught us much, very much. Above all, it has taught us for thousands of years to look upon life in any of its forms with interest and pleasure, and to educate our sensibilities so far that we at last cry, life, however it may be, is good. This teaching imparted by art to take pleasure in life and to regard human life as a piece of nature, as an object of regular evolution or development, and without being too violently involved in it. This teaching has been absorbed into us, and it now reemerges as an almighty requirement of knowledge, which is to say we can't pursue science and knowledge at all, except in terms of the affirmation of life which art has taught us. Is it even possible to give up on art? One could give up on art, but one would not thereby relinquish the capacities one has learned from it, just as one has given up religion, but not the enhancement of feeling and the exaltations one acquired from it. As the plastic arts and music are the measure of the wealth of feelings we have actually gained and obtained through religion, so if art disappeared, the intensity and multifariousness of the joy in life it has implanted would still continue to demand satisfaction. And thus Nietzsche finally arrives at what is probably the falsest claim in all of Human All Too Human, that the scientific man is the further evolution of the artistic. This kind of hope for a full sublimation of the powers of art, religion, and philosophy into science, in a way reflects the vacillating of a decadent. If only he could give up 3 great loves to find the one. At this point, I would tend to agree with Heidegger that while distinct, these 4 domains, religion, art, philosophy, and science, are each of them immortal and independent so long as human beings are, and that it's best for each human being if we give up on none of them. Of course, squirrely wizard that he is, Nietzsche is never going to let us off so easily in any of his writings. From the Souls of Artists and Writers, Book 4 of Human All Too Human concludes with the evening twilight of art, an aphorism at once visionary, charming, and very hard to argue with. Just as in old age one remembers one's youth and celebrates festivals of remembrance, so will mankind soon stand in relation to art. It will be a moving recollection of the joys of youth. Perhaps art has never been comprehended so profoundly or with so much feeling as it is now, when the magic of death seems to play around it. Recall that Greek city in South Italy which, on one day of the year, continued to celebrate their Greek festival and did so with tears and sadness at the fact that foreign barbarism was triumphing more and more over the customs they had brought with them. It is to be doubted whether the Hellenic has ever been so greatly savored, or its golden nectar imbibed with so much relish as it was among these declining Hellenes. If anyone out there is aware of which city in South Italy Nietzsche is referring to here, I'd love it if you let me know. Although Nietzsche will later come out in favor of Roman poetry and art, in this paragraph at least he's still very much a classical philologist and committed, despite himself, to the Hellenic spirit of art. The situation of these few Italic Greeks struggling to preserve the spirit of their gods and art is for Nietzsche here a microcosm of the situation of all of us. Genuine art survives now only in such small pockets. These last Hellenes are in other words a cipher for every human being still guided today by the torch of the history of art. Alas, the artist will soon be regarded as a glorious relic, and we shall bestow upon him as a marvelous stranger upon whose strength and beauty the happiness of former ages depended, honors such as we do not grant to others of our own kind. The best in us has been inherited from the sensibility of earlier ages, to which we hardly any longer have access by direct paths. The sun has already set, but the sky of our life still glows with its light, even though we no longer see it. What a beautiful riddle and conclusion to such a challenging book by Nietzsche. It sounds to my ears like Goethe's Orpheus parable, which as well ends in a world that continues to suffuse us even when we cannot see it. That being the conclusion of Book 4 of From the Souls of Artists and Writers, let's take a little break here before returning in broader outlines to the takeaways for us and the development of Nietzsche's thought in what followed in the rest of the Middle and later Nietzsche. Have a nice rest.